You can have a bonus point or two if you know who wrote that song. That would be Stephen Curtis Chapman. And he introduced that song right here where I'm standing. He did a concert here years ago, and he had just written 2 or 3 new worship tunes, and he introduced We Are More Than Conquerors right here at SMC. So we feel pretty blessed about that. My name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors. I'm glad you're here, and certainly those of you who are watching online. Today we're in the 4th week of a fall preaching series. We simply called it Birthmarks. Many of us were born with birthmarks, but what we wanted to talk about in this season was we wanted to look at some of the values that this church, I'm talking about SMC, what this church was born with way back in the middle of the 19th century. And these are the same values and the same priorities that have kept this church going for almost 166 years. But at the same time, it's kept us synced up and aligned with God's vision that he had for the church from the very beginning. And today we're going to read a well-known story about a man who I think you would agree where this guy found his niche. And it's a story about how God used him in a big time way when he had a chance. It was his time to step up and get in the game. And he made a strategic decision in that moment, even as a teenager, not to sit this one out. You can turn with me if you want to 1 Samuel 17. It's a story that you've heard about. It's the story of the showdown between a shepherd named David and an oversized Philistine named Goliath. Now, most of you are aware that for about 25 years, I was into recreational running. I officially retired from running. Last day that I ran was April 26, 2010. I tell people if you see me running now, something will be chasing me because I'm not running anymore. I got that out of my system. So many of you probably don't remember, if you're relatively new here, then you don't know that I was, can we say obsessed? Susan said, yes, we can. I was a little obsessed with running, and at least that was the accusation against me for quite a few years. I prefer to call it an intense hobby. So whichever. Running was a recreational diversion for me. It gave me a whole lot more than I was able to give to it. Plus I developed some lifelong friendships, and I still have some of those guys kind of standing in my corner now. Now, this is not a trick question, but why do people go to a gym or a fitness center? Or in my case, over to the YMCA? It's not a rhetorical question either if you want to shout it out. Well, y'all don't go to fitness gyms. Okay, so, well, anyway, the people like me that do, we go to work out. Now, I'm fully aware that there are some people who go to a gym to socialize. And they pay money, they have a membership at a fitness center, but they don't work out or sweat or engage the adventure, or they don't push their bodies to new levels of endurance like some of us. However, the fact is that you're never going to get the benefit from a gym membership if you go once a week and you just kind of hang out with the other members and drink a Gatorade every now and then and have a conversation or two, and then you watch other people work out. And then you take a shower and expect that somebody's going to notice how well you look for all of those exercises that you do. So if you want the benefits of exercise, you either have to run or swim or get on a cardio machine, and you have to sweat and lift and strain, and every now and then you got to grunt a few times. Now, I'm pretty sure that I've been going to the Y for 40 years. I'm pretty sure that the people over at the YMCA would not consider me to be a devoted member if I showed up every single day, but they never saw me sweat. Almost positive of that. And yet, we sometimes do that for years in the life of the church. Whenever we fail to engage and invest in the experience. My prayer this week has been that some of that's going to change for someone in our church today. Since the day this church was established, January 1855, SMC has been serious about reaching out to people and seeing people who were far from God. I mean, I've read the journals of the pastors who were here way back in the 19th century, and it was the same then. They were trying to reach this small community in those days with a life-changing relationship with God, but even that has never been enough for us. We want to see those people the light comes on for them and they put their arms around Jesus. We want to see those people grow up and become all that God has in store for them. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Let me set the context. This is very important. Now, throughout the remainder of this message, you're going to hear about two groups of people. There were the Israelites. Those were God's people, the good guys, and the Philistines. They were the bad guys. Now, I know it's not politically correct to call people the bad guys, so if it feels better to you, we'll just call them public enemy number one. Now, these two nations, Israel and the Philistine nation, they had been at odds for years, and so they had been at war, and a showdown was inevitable. And I think that both sides knew that if they went to war, it was not going to be good. It would be nasty, and it would be like shock and awe. And lots of people would lose their lives. So they came up with a better plan. The leaders of the two countries came to an agreement that each side would choose their best and most skilled warrior. Everybody else would be spectators, and there would be this one-on-one contest, and it was winner take all. Makes good sense. But here's where the problem started for the good guys, the Israelites. Let me illustrate that. I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. I've only known him for about 4 or 5 weeks, but he attends SMC. He's a first-year basketball player over at Elon. That is Andrew Junkin, who happens to be 7 feet tall. Now, I'm so glad when they took that picture the other day that they didn't show it like from the knees up, because then you would have been thinking that maybe he was standing on a. No, he wasn't standing on a chair. Now, I want you to keep this 7-footer in mind. The Israelite army and the Philistines, they agree that they're going to have this one-on-one showdown. This is for all the marbles. But the good guys agreed that before the plan, they would try to find somebody in their group, but what they did not know is that the Philistines had a man in their army who had obviously been pumping himself up with steroids because he was over 9 feet tall. I'm talking about a guy that would make Andrew look small. Now look, I asked Andrew, I said, so what is your reach? And he said, my fingertips when I'm standing on my feet will go about 9 feet. Now, so Goliath is this big against a 7-footer. We're talking about a really big dude. Here we go, 1 Samuel 17. Goliath stood and shouted across to the Israelites, do you need a whole army to settle this? Choose someone to fight for you, and I will represent the Philistines. We will settle this dispute by a single contest. If your man is able to kill me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel. Send me a man who will fight with me. And when Saul, who was the king of Israel, when Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Well, no kidding. Jump down to verse 16. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now remember, the good guys, they don't have the luxury of watching a YouTube video on 10 ways to stop a giant. So this is all new to them. My guess is that the good guys were probably having some off-camera leadership meetings and strategy sessions. What's the best way for us to negotiate this challenge? But nobody was making a move. I'm sure Saul the king was saying, I need a volunteer. Not a single volunteer. And every now and then, sometimes that happens to a church. Decades ago, the leaders of SMC decided that we were not going to keep just talking about the future. We were going to start trying to see if we could get a vision for that future. So we began making some pretty courageous decisions about how would we best be able to influence the last 20 years or so of the 20th century walking into the 21st century. Let me take you back to the year 1991. So Bob, I bet y'all hunkered down in strategy sessions and prayed up a storm. Well, of course we did. I prayed so much I had calluses on my knees. But it's not fair, everybody, for us to use prayer as an excuse to never get off our caboose. But that can be a problem every now and then in churches. See if I can illustrate that. Many of our college students, at least the ones at Elon, they just finished their midterm exams. Now, I don't know about you, but I used to pray up a storm when I had exams. I don't even know if I knew Jesus real well, but I was praying up a storm when I had exams. You know, somebody said there'll always be prayer in schools as long as there are exams. And I guess that would be true. So back in 91, man, I was praying. But I was studied up. I was prepared. I had a college roommate. I had a couple of different roommates over the years, but I had one college roommate, and he never studied. He had terrible study habits, and he used to ask me. He knew I was a follower of Christ. He said, "Hey, can you pray for me, man? Can you pray before this test?" And I would say, "Have you studied?" And of course the answer was no. And he would always say, "Well, not much." And I would say, "So you want me to pray for God to favor you with this careless stupidity of not studying?" What I'm saying is we just can't sit around in small group meetings and wonder about all the thousands of people who live around this church or churches all across our county, people who are spiritually lost and confused, and they're facing a Christless eternity one of these days. So we have to build some redemptive relationships with those people and see if we can get our arms around as many of those people as possible. So, Bob, what are we going to do about all the average and mediocre marriages in this community? That's a great question. Well, we're going to hold marriage seminars, and we're going to have re-engage classes, and we're going to offer counseling, and we're going to give sermons on how to breathe life into marriages. So, Bob, what are we going to do about all the homelessness and the poverty in this city? Well, we're going to serve meals over at the shelter, and we're going to stock the shelves of food pantry. Some of you brought food today, and we're going to join hands with Habitat for Humanity, and we're going to build some houses. So, Bob, what are we going to do about all the spiritual darkness and complacency in our high schools? Well, we're going to raise up and equip a generation of school teachers and coaches and people who will influence the Board of Education members, people who are strong and resolved, and we're going to say, you go make faith decisions, and then you try to influence as many people as possible. We're going to teach our teenagers. You know what we're going to teach our teenagers? How to be bright lights in the midst of their darkness. So, Bob, what are we going to do about all the addictions that just shatter the hearts and families around? We're going to open our arms to people like that. People who are bound up and imprisoned to their own life decisions and their own lifestyles. And we're going to make recovery groups available, like Alcoholics Anonymous, who meets here several times a week. Now, these and many others, these are gigantic challenges. And we're not going to wake up one day and everything's just going to be magically great. So we will face those battles. And we'll take them on because our God is more than a conqueror. Now, if you want to do something significant with your one and only life, if you want to do something that will make a difference in years from now, step one, it's almost never a big step. Almost never. Let's keep reading. Let me show you how God is going to get David into the game. This is so cool. David's brothers. David was he was the youngest of 8 kids, 8 sons. His dad was Jesse. And all the other boys were already enlisted in the Israeli army. One day, Jesse, that's David's father, told David, hurry and take this sack of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers at the army camp. And here are 10 large chunks of cheese to take to their commanding officer. Find out how your brothers are doing and bring something back that shows me that they're all right. They're with Saul's army fighting the Philistines. Now, I realize that probably most of you already know how this story is going to come to an end, so you know how it's going to turn out. But watch this. The first thing that God needed to do was, how am I going to get David to the front lines where the action is? And it all started one day when his dad said, hey, son, I need you to take some grilled cheese sandwiches. It's what it looked like to me, Phil. You know, some bread and cheese. I mean, what else are you going to do with bread and cheese? I need you to take it to your brothers who are fighting out there on the front lines of the army. Now, I want you to notice that David does not resist. He doesn't argue with his dad. The very next statement is one of the most strategic verses in all the Bible. David obeyed his father. Now, don't miss this. If you ever think that you might do something significant for God, don't forget that many times it begins with one simple yes in the smaller responsibilities. A couple of weeks ago, I was having coffee with a pastor of a really small church. It's a church near Winston-Salem. It's about 50 people in attendance. And I'm just building a relationship with this young guy. He's a neat guy. He's got a good future, I think. And he said, boy, I bet it's a blast to be a pastor of a church big like St. Mark's. And I wanted to say, well, there's a whole lot to that story that I don't have time to tell you today. But I said, let me tell you something. 45 years ago, when my wife and I were serving and leading a church of 35, we were having a blast. We just didn't know it. For example, do you think it was an accident that God selected Moses to lead this great freedom movement in the book of Exodus? Only after Moses had spent 40 years on the backside of a mountain tending a bunch of sheep for his father-in-law. Or what about Peter? Peter, who became the rock of the early church. And where did he get his experience? He had a fishing business. Pretty simple. These guys proved themselves, Moses, David, I could name 100 other people in the scriptures, in the small responsibilities. David obeyed his father. He got up early the next morning and left someone else in charge of the sheep. He was a simple shepherd. Then he loaded the supplies and started off. He reached the army camp just as the soldiers were taking their places and shouting the battle cry. Now, so what were the soldiers doing? Not much. They were just singing the fight song. That's all, making a lot of noise. So how many times had they already backed down from this one-on-one contest with the giant Philistine? If I'm doing the count right, every day, twice a day, Goliath would come out and taunt these people. So we're talking 40 days. That's 80 times. 80 times. And not a single person in the army had stepped up yet. Now, I'm trying to picture this scene. They're out here shouting and singing fight songs and giving high fives and talking trash about how we're going to go out there one of these days and we're going to kick that Philistine's caboose. I don't know if you figured it out or not, but God's not impressed with a whole bunch of empty words. When I was in high school, and I played a little football, mostly baseball, but we had one coach, my baseball coach. And if the other team was kind of talking up stuff, you know how teenage kids will beat their chest and all that kind of stuff. You know what he used to say? He would look at us and say, the whistle don't pull the train, boys. That's a good one in the field. The whistle don't pull the train. Look at this drama here. The army of Israel and the Philistine army stood there facing each other. David left his things with the man in charge of supplies and ran up to the battle line to ask his brothers if they were well. That's what his dad said. Go find out if your brothers are okay. While David was talking to them, Goliath came out from the line of Philistines and started boasting as usual. David heard him. You got it? David heard him. When the Israelite soldiers saw Goliath, they were scared and ran off. So much for the fight song. What did my coach say? The whistle don't pull the train. These guys were talking a big game, but when the challenge showed up, what did they do? They tucked tails and ran. Somebody needed to kick it into gear. Some of you have been attending this church, maybe for a while. Some of you months, maybe even years. A few of you decades. And sometimes people leave here on the weekends and they'll say, you know what? It's probably time for us to get connected or reconnected. We need to be serving and volunteering and giving something back. And you can talk about that till the cows come home, but until you get off the bench, All of that's just a bunch of chatter, just a bunch of talk. Let's keep reading the story because, well, it's about to get really good. Watch this. King Saul is going to raise the stakes in a serious way. They said, the army said, look at this man, talking about the giant. He keeps coming out to challenge Israel. The king will give a large sum of money to whoever kills him. He will also let whoever kills him marry his daughter, and his father's family will not have to pay taxes in Israel. Now look, that's a serious payday. You take the Philistine out and you get a whole bunch of money, you get a wife, and you get exemption from paying taxes for the rest of your life. Not a bad deal, really. But these soldiers are sitting around looking at each other and saying, somebody needs to go do something. I've said for decades that it doesn't really help all that much when somebody wants to tell me about something here at SMC that's not hitting on all cylinders. I mean, I sometimes have to listen to that stuff, but it doesn't help any. I'm looking for people who say, I want to get on the solution side of the equation. Look at this. David asked some soldiers standing by, who does that worthless Philistine think he is? He's making fun of the army of the living God. They've all been saying, the guy's too big, he's too strong, he's got a lot more experience than we do. We would never be able to take him out. You know what David is thinking? He's so big, I couldn't miss him. But don't overlook this critical part of the story. David would never have been able to be facing this huge opportunity if he had not been willing to obey his father to deliver the cheese. I wonder how many big ministry opportunities we've missed out on over the years because we were not willing to follow God in some of the smaller responsibilities. I wonder what God might do if our attitude was, wherever, whenever, whatever, whoever, however. Just say it, God, and we're in. But let me be really quick to point out that when we decide that we're going to attempt to do some greater things for God, there are going to be some roadblocks and some complications. You know, the first thing we face as a church every time we decide to do something special for God? Criticism. Every time. And it can be pretty painful. And one of the hardest things to swallow is when the criticism comes from people who are closest to you. Watch this. David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard him talking with the soldiers. Eliab was angry at him and said, "What are you doing here anyway? Who's taking care of that little flock of sheep out in the desert, you spoiled brat? You came here just to watch us fighting, didn't you?" All David said was, "Who does that Philistine think he is?" And the next thing, his big brother's in his face saying, "You don't have any right to be here anyway." Hey, look, don't ever be surprised when we get criticized, when we set goals that some people think are unreachable or out of touch or too expensive. I don't think we'll ever do anything significant for God without facing some opposition and some criticism. A couple of years ago, I received an email from a guy. He admitted right up front that he had only attended SMC one time. Now, let me ask you, do you form your final opinion, your final conclusions after you attend one class at the beginning of the semester? Or eat out one time at a restaurant? Or shop one time at a department store? Or enjoy one day of your vacation? Or just go to one game of your favorite team? I hope not. I mean, I hope you don't come to all your conclusions at that point. This guy had been here one time. But he said, you know what he said? "But I've heard a lot about your church." I bet. And he had some in-your-face questions about how we do church. So I wrote him back And I said, hey, you got some great questions, but you're talking about some very sensitive issues. I don't want to respond by email. I'd rather sit down and talk in person. And he wrote me back almost immediately, and he said, and I want to read this, that won't be necessary. You've given me my answer by your failure to answer my questions. You people are going to wind up in hell for teaching heresy. That was clear. I got it. You know, sometimes, every time I get something like that, I think, you know, I think I've been told, Phil, let me just say, I think I've been told more times since I became a Christian that I was going to hell than before I accepted Christ and my destination was still up for grabs. The chances are high that, I'm telling you, whenever you decide that you're going to attempt to do something special for God, you'd better be able to take a hit, because I'm telling you, the skeptics and the cynics, they'll be everywhere, verse 32. Don't worry about a thing, David told the king. I'll go fight this Philistine. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can go up against this Philistine. You are only a boy, and he has been in the army since he was a boy. There's a great lesson in there somewhere, everybody. I subscribe to a little email service. It comes every Monday. It's called Monday Morning Quarterback. It's got nothing to do with athletics. Recently, there was an article that said this. The next time you're planning to do something for God and somebody who's not doing a thing for God tells you that you can't do it, don't pay attention. That makes sense? Just go do it, it said. So here's the king, Saul. He was the first king of Israel. What was he doing? Nada, nothing. And he tells David, now he's not doing anything, but he tells David, you can't do it. You can't be successful against this giant. Many times we have to decide, look, over the years we've had to decide we're not going to listen to people who never attempt great things for God. Let me illustrate that. When we started transitioning this church about 30 years ago, we were moving in the direction of a brand new vision that we had mapped out. There were plenty of people, even some here, that told us that we can never do it. And some of those people were experienced church leaders. So we're in the early 90s. There was not one book on the subject of transitioning a long-established church in a new direction. I used to go to conferences a lot, but there was not one seminar, not one conference that you could go to that would help you be able to figure that out. There was not, no, what's this now? There was not one established church in America who had ever figured it out and accomplished it. It was a lonely journey for a long time, because every day when we put the plow to the ground, we were plowing brand new ground. Some people were saying, man, that kind of church, you know, will never work in Burlington, North Carolina. And Bob, you're too young. You don't have the experience and the know-how, and SMC will never be able to figure it out. For the record, just for the record, you need to know that I've never made it a habit of listening to people who are doing nothing for God tell us what we can't do for God. That makes sense? It would probably be more prudent for us to focus our energy and attention on the faithfulness of God. I remember the first time I got in some trouble as a church leader. I think, it's been a long time ago, I think God was preparing me for the future. I didn't know it then, but this was almost 50 years ago. I was a volunteer youth pastor at a small church that had about 125 people on a good Sunday. And the pastor, I liked him okay, but he wasn't very helpful. He didn't know what was going on much. And he just told me, he said, I want you to reach kids. That's what he said. I want you to reach kids. So on Sunday nights, we would kind of turn the fellowship hall into a giant game room, and we got a whole bunch of high school kids, coming together. We were having a blast. But then at one point we didn't have any resources. We didn't have resources much at all. So one Sunday, old naive Bob, I decided that I would go speak to the men's Bible class. These were the old dudes in their 50s and 60s. Hey, look, I was 19. So I said, would y'all get behind the kids and cough up some money? Did I mention that I was naive? One of the members of the class, I'm making this little 5-minute speech, and one of the members of the class stood up and interrupted me. And he said, we're sick and tired of kids running all over this church building on Sunday nights. We come over here sometimes on Monday. We never know what condition the church is going to be like. You young people are going to destroy this church and the future. Now look, when you're 19 years old and you love Jesus as much as I did then, and you want everybody to appreciate your enthusiasm, did I mention I was naive? I look back at that man, I can't believe I said this, and I said, these young people are the future of the church. And you know what I said to him? Get used to it. Can you believe I did that? And he told me, he said, if y'all continue this boisterous gathering in our church, we're gonna have to let you go. I was a volunteer. And they were gonna fire me. But I came through. You know why? Because I was telling myself, at least we're trying to reach kids. That's what they asked me to do. You know something? Today that church has about 20 people in it. They probably will not survive. I've been doing ministry a long time now, and especially if you give me, do I get any credit for that volunteer stuff? Probably not, but what I figured out a long time ago is that God is never going to challenge a group of people, or even you as an individual. God is never going to challenge people to do something unless he's willing to empower it and to resource it. You know, I like the way Jesus did it. You can't find one single time when Jesus he had a study course on prayer. He just taught his guys how to pray. Jesus didn't say, hey, I got this great book for you to read on missions. He just took them on mission trips. He never called anybody that had been to divinity school or wait for them to graduate from the seminary or anything before he gave them kingdom assignments. He sent them out before they were ready. And he said, you'll figure it out. You'll learn from your experiences. You think I was ready to lead this church in 1978? Are you kidding me? 25 years old. Now watch this drama. David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep, he said. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and take the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. Now look, I know some dudes who are into hunting, and they tell me about, they go in the wintertime and they put on a whole bunch of camouflage and they climb up in a tree and it's 25 degrees and they sit there and wait for some defenseless deer to come along and they shoot it from 100 yards with a rifle and they call that hunting. Now, David was a hunter. I mean, if you want to impress me, then you show me a picture of when you went after a lion or a bear with your bare hands. Let's keep going. Sir, he's talking to the king now. Sir, I have killed lions and bears that way, and I can kill this worthless Philistine. He should not have made fun of the army of the living God. The Lord has rescued me from the claws of lions and bears, and he will keep me safe from the hands of this Philistine. Look at this. All right, Saul answered. Go ahead and fight him. You better hope God's with you, or you're going to be in big trouble. Don't miss this. David was not focused on his own limitations, but always on the faithfulness of God. And in the same way that God helped David in some of the lesser responsibilities of his life, like taking care of his sheep, David believed with everything in him that God would come through with some of the tougher battles that he would eventually face. What I like about this story is that God was focused on David's strength, not his weakness. He had some experience. We often do just the opposite, don't we? For example, think about this for a minute. If our football coaches at Elon, if you saw in the newspaper that they were sending our quarterbacks to a kicking camp, a kicking clinic, you'd say, what in the world are they thinking? How crazy is that? You'd be right. We have a very gifted, talented quarterback right now. He's in his 5th year. He's got phenomenal arm strength. He understands the game. I mean, 5 years, he's a veteran. He should. So doesn't it make sense that our offensive game plan is going to be built around the strength of his game? It's the way coaches do it. Why would they focus? Why would they say, well, you know, Davis is his name is Davis. Davis is a good guy. He's a good quarterback, but we don't need to worry about him. No, that's always been the strategy here at SMC. When we start hiring staff members, we hire staff members based on gifts and skills and spiritual maturity, those things that they can bring to the table. So why would it be prudent to evaluate potential staff members based on the things they're not good at? I'm not saying that we should ignore people's weaknesses. What we do is we minimize the impact of our weaknesses, but I am saying that it's more important to maximize a person's strength. The same is true for a church. So we place a disproportionate amount of time and resources into those things that we're really good at as a church. If I can use athletic terminology, what we're doing is, as a church, we play to our strengths. Does that make sense? The answer is yes. Does that make sense? For example, I got an email from someone a few months ago. They said, so why don't we ever do music with a large choir? We don't have a choir. I mean, you can't do music with a choir if you don't have one. It's not one of our strengths. God has carved out SMC with a very unique DNA, and it doesn't serve us well to do things or to try things that we're not good at. Watch this. Saul put his own clothes on David. He put a bronze helmet on his head and dressed him in his armor. David put on Saul's sword and tried to walk around, but he was not used to all. David's just a little guy. Not used to all the armor Saul had put on him. He said to Saul, I can't go in this because I'm not used to it. Then David took it all off. Do you see what was happening here? Saul was a great warrior. There's no doubt about it. He was a great military man, but he thought he could just instantaneously transform this shepherd kid into a military man. It wasn't going to happen. God has a great plan for you and me and every one of us. No two of us are alike, and that's good. And so the same thing is true for churches. 4,100 years ago, God went to a man named Abraham. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 12. And God said, I'm going to make it possible one day. The man was 75 years old when God told him this, so you figure this out. I'm going to make it possible for you to have a whole bunch of kids, a whole bunch of offspring. And through your family heritage, I'm going to eventually bless the whole world, and I'm going to establish my covenant agreement with you, Abraham. God said, I will bless you, but you're going to be responsible for carrying my redemptive plans to the whole world. 2,000 years later, this guy's riding along on his horse one day. He gets knocked off his horse. His name was Paul. He was one of the great enemies of the early church. And God told him, Paul, you are going to take the gospel. Now, this was the gospel that Paul didn't even believe in. You are going to take the gospel and you're going to preach to the non-Jewish world, the Gentiles. And that responsibility was every bit as difficult as what God laid on Abraham. And here's God approaching a young shepherd, David, giving him a very significant kingdom assignment. David took his stick in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from a stream. He put them in his shepherd's bag and grabbed his sling. Then he went to meet the Philistine. At the same time, the Philistine was coming closer to David. The man who held his shield walked in front of him. When Goliath looked at David and saw that he was only a boy, tanned and handsome, he looked down on David with disgust. He said, do you think I'm a dog that you come after me with a stick? He said to David, come here, I'll feed your body to the birds of the air and the wild animals. Now don't forget, David is still a teenager, probably 5 feet 8 inches tall. And here's this guy over 9 feet tall. And keep that in mind as we read the rest of this narrative. This is so good. David shouted in reply, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, the Lord will conquer you. Well, I'll bet that just struck fear in the heart of this 9-foot man. And then David says, this very day, God is handing you over to me. I'm about to kill you. And the whole earth will know that there is an extraordinary God in Israel. David just believed that God would give him the victory. David said, he's talking to the big guy, everyone gathered here will know that the Lord does not need swords or spears to save people. The battle belongs to God, and he will hand you over to us. This is absolutely unparalleled confidence in God. As Goliath came near to attack him, David ran quickly to meet him. I'm assuming, here's a smooth stone that I got out of a creek. So I'm assuming the stone is something like this right here. David ran quickly, took the stone from his bag, put it into his sling and slung it. The stone hit the Philistine and went deep into his forehead, and Goliath fell face down on the ground. So David defeated the Philistine with only a sling and a stone. He hit him and killed him. He did not even have a sword in his hand. David did precisely what he said he would do. And if we're going to be the people that God has called us to be right here, then we have to finish what it is. What is it that God has equipped and empowered this church to do in the 21st century? So if you're a guest here today, and some of you are because I've already met you, just pretend that I didn't say this. Just strike it from your record. But if you are invested here at SMC, you need to listen carefully. When you committed yourself to this church, whenever it was, and here's what you said: I will attend, I will serve, I will invest in a community group, I'll be involved with some other people, and I will invite people, and I will give. And I'm challenging you based on this story to do what you said, what you told God you would do. We can make this happen if one by one by one we do it together. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. One man, the power of one, set a whole group of people free. Let me illustrate. I'm going to take you back almost 18 years. I received this email on December the 28th, 2003. Bob, you don't know me, but I was in your church on Christmas Eve night for the first time. I'd like to briefly share my story. My husband walked out on me and my 3 children just 2 days before Christmas, leaving us devastated. I have never been so depressed or frightened. On Christmas Eve afternoon, I was in such despair that I got the kids in the car and we just started driving aimlessly around Burlington. I was at the lowest of the lows. When I just aimlessly drove past your church, I saw a lot of cars in the parking lot. People were piling into the church. I thought to myself, maybe somebody in there will care about us. So I pulled my car into the parking lot. It was cold and there was a drizzling rain, so I sat in my car for a few minutes thinking, I can't get these 3 kids into that church with the rain and everything else. So I put my head on the steering wheel and I started to cry. After a few minutes, somebody knocked on the window of my car. It was a man with an umbrella and a reflecting vest, and he said, I'll be glad to help you. I'm here to serve. The man carried my 2-year-old under his coat and held the umbrella while I helped the other 2 children, and we made it into the building. He helped my kids get settled in the children's program. He even introduced me to a very nice family who let me sit with them during the service. I'm writing this to you because I just wanted you to know that on Christmas Eve, I started to believe in angels. I met one in your parking lot. Thank you all for saving my Christmas. One person. Do you know we've never been able to find out who that guy was? So if you're rocking babies in the nursery, teaching the 5-year-olds, out there parking cars, holding a door open and saying hello to somebody, making coffee, playing an instrument here on this stage or in our student ministry band, if you're sitting behind one of those cameras right now, if you're holding an umbrella for a lonely single mom, 1,000 other things, you're making a difference. It all matters. It's the power of one. Every great move, check me out on this. Every great movement in history can always be tracked back to one person who had a dream and a passion to make a difference. Now, if you read the next chapter of this story, you'll see that David eventually became the second king of Israel. He became a great military man. And if you turn, watch this now. Then if you fast forward way over into the New Testament and you read the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see that David, there's a long genealogy of Jesus, and you'll see somewhere in there the name David, an ancestor of Jesus. And how did he get there? He brought some bread and cheese to his brothers. And now we know the rest of the story. Imagine, can you, that someday the thousands of people who live within 5 or 10 miles of this church, people who today drive by this place maybe 20 times a week and they never give God or church or Jesus a second thought. Imagine that someday in the future, so many of those people might be compelled to change their minds about Jesus and just be glad, they'll be glad that there's a church like this one with unique birthmarks, with our eyes to the future, when we decide to do it together. I love you, SMC.